this get you started in the way you wanted to go?
This would be perfect.
Okay, very good. So proceed.
I'll begin. My name is David Devereaux. I'm the spokesperson for the Confederation of Clubs of Washington State. I'm a member of the Outsiders Motorcycle Club, and I'm also part of a national organization called the U.S. Defenders. Basically, this issue is simple. 19 states, including Washington, are the only ones to still have universal helmet requirements. And the central issue in this entire debate comes down to a very simple question, and that's whether mandatory and universal helmet laws are an unjustified restriction on individual liberties compared to any impact that they may have on what the proponents call the public burden or health care costs, for example. Now, the proponents believe that these health care costs are overwhelming and should subsume the rights of the individual to make their individual choice. I, on the other hand, in our contention, is that Washington's law goes too far and is too much of an intrusion on individual liberties and personal rights relative to so many arguments that help defeat the public burden. For example, there's statistical analysis that was very, very well offered that, is obviously a part of every one of our arguments. There's so many protected activities that carry a larger public burden, yet we still legally respect their right to make that personal choice, independent of the fact that I think this legislation is completely inconsistent with the policymaking framework and schematic that has been driving Washington legislation and the will of the people, really, for the last few years. I think a good place to begin the discussion is what the courts have had to say about Washington's helmet law. And this dates all the way back to a Supreme Court decision in 1969, 2 years after of our original universal prohibition. And the Supreme Court of the state of Washington conceded that the legislature, y'all, are primarily responsible for determining how much police power should be applied in terms of helmets. You have that constitutional right. But the court also warned us that you need to balance those personal interests with the public interest, and that's done at the legislative level. In fact, Justice Hill issued a warning in that decision that said, if we allow the legislature, now that they have this police power, to take this to the extreme, it would be possible, based on the same analysis that's used to justify the helmet law, to be able to require pedestrians to wear a helmet when they cross the street. So that also brings us to the point where that's why every state is different. Every state legislature has discretion in how they apply their police power. And the question becomes, what type of state do we live in and what type of state do we want to live in? I think we live in a state where the mandatory helmet requirement for people 18 years and older should be eliminated, because I think the intrusion on individual privacy rights far outweighs any impact to the public interest. First, look at all the activities that are condoned that we all accept and inarguably have a higher public burden to them. Take smoking and alcohol. According to the Washington Department of Health, smoking costs this state $1.6 billion a year. Independent of that, alcohol, the third leading cause of death in the United States, causes over 2,000 deaths in the state of Washington. Now, even though the public burden is inarguably higher than anything that we're discussing here, these are two individual choices that are respected by our legislature. Our legislature says, yes, they may be dangerous and they may be unhealthy, but it is your right as a citizen to make that individual personal safety choice. Now, I also think that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment leads a little bit of direction, because the 14th Amendment says that every class and group in society should have equal protection of the laws. Why would we provide protection for smokers and alcohol drinkers that we wouldn't provide for motorcyclists, especially when the so-called public burden we're discussing is so much lower? In fact, this whole idea of a public burden is highly suspect. It's debatable in the very least, if not completely untrue. In addition to the National Center for Health Statistics study that says motorcyclists account for 0.001% of all accidents and only a fraction of those are caused by helmetless riders, it also concluded that 65% of all accidents that involve motorcycles occur in states with mandatory helmet laws. So there's no correlation to whether you're wearing a helmet or not. Independent of that, I think you need to look at the other side of the coin, and the other side of the coin says there's huge economic benefits to repealing a mandatory helmet law, which you have to weigh in any cost-benefit analysis that you apply to the issue. According to the Department of Licensing, the two most recent states that we have statistics on, Texas and Florida, there was a 150% increase in new motorcycle endorsements and new motorcycle licenses after they repealed helmet laws. This would bring over $3 billion into the Washington economy, in addition to $200 million specifically to the Washington State Treasury through licensing and taxing. And those facts are relatively indisputable. So I think that you need to compare those economic benefits that come with repealing the law versus the so-called cost that the proponents of a mandatory helmet law try to advance. In addition to that, I think that this universal helmet law is completely inconsistent with the policymaking schematic that's been driving this legislature and the people of Washington, in other words, the will of the people for the last few years. We're the state that recognizes and respects same-sex marriages. We're the state that's legalized medical and now recreational use of marijuana. We're the state that has motorcycle and racial profiling laws. We are the state that has embraced and advance the interest of individual choice over the paternalistic instinct of the government to control us for our own good. I don't think that it's consistent. And I think that the final argument that bolsters that inconsistency is the fact that we have the most advanced privacy rights in the entire Union. We have Article 1, Section 7 of the Washington State Constitution, which extends privacy rights far beyond the limited protections of the Fourth Amendment. And once you consider the fact that motorcyclists have explicitly been given this right to privacy while they're riding their motorcycles through this very legislature, pretextual traffic stop legislation and motorcycle profiling legislation, both of which recognize that explicit right to privacy, I think that really you as the legislature need to define where that bright line should be. And I think that bright line should be much more in the arena of individual choice and individual liberties than it should be in the arena of paternalism. Now, I want to close with an important thing and something that's close to my heart. We worked very hard to pass motorcycle profiling legislation a couple of sessions ago, and we were able to unanimously pass it. One of the important things about almost every motorcycle profiling incident up to the point of that legislation, which has been 95% effective, is that motorcycle stops were the primary trigger for profiling stops. Them pulling us over because of our motorcycle helmet. So this policy does transition into other areas of government. It does transition to other areas of personal rights. That was one of the biggest problems we had in the profiling dispute. In fact, if you remember, the $90,000 judgment that was granted against the State Patrol and the state of Washington was over a helmet stop that wasn't justified. Now, I think that this debate has existed for a long time, and the reason it's existed for a long time is the will of the people changes over time. We went from no helmet law previous to 1967 to a universal helmet law in 1967 to elimination and complete freedom of choice in 1977 to a limited choice in 87.
Devereaux, you have obviously come very prepared, but we have other members behind you that want to testify as well, so if you could wrap up.
Is that my 3 minutes? I think that I've made a very credible argument for why you should repeal a helmet law.
I apologize for interrupting, but
no apologies necessary.
You do know and came prepared, and we appreciate that very much. Sir.
For the record, Madam Chair, Mr.